I froze when I arrived late to the company party and saw my best friend dancing with my wife. But it wasn't just any dance. The way he held her by the waist, the look they exchanged as if they were alone in the world, his hands going down a little too far, everything screamed that this wasn't just a dance. And the most unbearable thing was that she didn't back down. On the contrary, she smiled, responded, surrendered herself. My stomach turned inside out. A heat ran up my back, a nausea invaded me. And I knew, deep down in my chest, that this moment was just the tip of something much bigger. There, in the middle of the loud music and the flashes of the company cameras, something inside me broke. But my reaction was silence. I hid among the fake smiles, pretended to answer a call, took a deep breath, and left with the only certainty that mattered: I needed to find out the truth. For days, I tortured myself with doubt. I relived the scene 1,000 times. I began to notice the small details that I had previously ignored: her deleted messages, the smiles that disappeared when I entered the room, the excuses for late meetings, his trips that always coincided with her absences. I began to put together a puzzle of lies. And each piece fit together with cruel perfection. In silence, I began to investigate. I connected dots that I had not seen before. A printed email forgotten in the company printer, a restaurant bill marked on her card with his name, a late-night Uber registered on suspicious dates. I put it all together. With each new discovery, the ground moved further away from under my feet. My best friend. My wife. Cheating on me with exquisite cynicism. Within our routine, our marriage, the environment in which everyone knew us as the exemplary couple. And there I was, blind, proud, believing that love was enough. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the contempt. The trust one had placed in them being treated like dirt. They played with my name, my body, my house, as if I were an extra in my own life. But still, I held myself together. I planned everything with the coldness of a surgeon. The divorce? Drafted down to the smallest detail. The paperwork? Separate, with dates, proof, signatures, records and witnesses. Everything ready. And I was calm, incredibly calm, as if the weight was finally being replaced by steel. But then the unexpected happened. She cried. She knelt down. She begged me. She asked for forgiveness. She said she had lost herself. That it wasn't love. That she wanted to go back. That she understood everything too late. That what she had with him was a fantasy, and that she only realized the reality when she found herself faced with my absence. And I listened to her. I listened to everything. In silence. She said, I destroyed my life, and I thought, you destroyed mine too. She said, you are the man of my life, and I thought, I was, and you killed me a little bit every day. But the worst question that echoed in my mind was, why now? Why was it only when she felt the loss? Why was it only when the divorce came with legal force, with clauses that left her empty-handed, that she decided she loved me? Love is not regret. Love is not coming back when you lose. Love is not leaving. Love is respecting even when the other person is not looking. But what she never imagined is that, while she was playing love with my friend, the world was spinning. And in silence, in the pain of loneliness, someone appeared. A woman who didn't know my story, but knew how to recognize my scars. And over time, with delicacy, she began to heal them. Without rushing. Without demands. Without promises. Just with presence, listening and respect. She made me laugh when I thought I didn't know how to smile anymore. She made me feel seen, desired, admired. Everything I begged for years, from someone who said they loved me, but never saw me. The funny thing? Betrayal destroyed me, but it also freed me. I discovered that my worth didn't depend on the recognition of the person who betrayed me. I discovered that losing someone who didn't value me was the greatest gift that destiny could give me. She tried to come back, but she found a man who wasn't the same anymore. And not for revenge, but for growth. When she said, "Do you still love me?" I simply replied, "I love myself enough to not accept so little anymore." And there, for the first time, she understood the size of the mistake she had made. Betrayal is not just sharing a bed with another. It is the absence in small moments. It is the contempt in words. It is the neglect in touch. And when love ends, the silence is deafening. But there is something crueler than being betrayed. It is being remembered only when the other realizes that they have lost. And as noble as forgiveness is, sometimes it is just the bridge between the past and freedom. She now lives with the pain of regret, with the memories of what she destroyed with her own hands. And he, my former friend, discovered what it is to be just an option of convenience. They realized too late that when trust is broken, love turns to dust. And in that dust, I planted something new. Something pure. Something that began without masks. But there was something she never knew. Something that not even her lover found out. A detail, a last fragment of truth, hidden on the day of the company party, in that dance that exposed everything. Something that I saw, and that I didn't tell anyone. Something that would change everything. Because in the end, not everything was what it seemed that night. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one deceived in that story. But that will only be revealed at the right time. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make something very clear: we do not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on the real emotions that destroy lives when loyalty is broken. Our goal is one, to show, with intensity, how betrayal corrodes relationships, tears off masks and leaves deep scars. Get ready to dive into a narrative shocking, engaging and full of consequences. The truth hurts, and in this story, it will hurt until the end. Good story. It was hard to find someone who didn't like Daniel. Tall, with a smile that seemed to come from within and a calm way of listening to others as if every word had value, he was the kind of man who made friends easily, but trusted few. He was 37 years old and lived his life with responsibility, balance and a certain serenity that came from someone who had already faced important losses and learned to live with them. From a very young age, he carried the weight of being the oldest brother in a fractured family. His parents separated when he was still a teenager, and it was he who supported the emotional support of his two younger brothers while his mother divided her time between two jobs. He learned early on that love was not just a feeling, it was an attitude. It was presence. And it was with this spirit that he built his life, his business and his relationship with the woman he had chosen to walk by his side. Elizabeth appeared like a warm breeze on an ordinary autumn afternoon. She had large, almost golden brown eyes and a beauty that was not obvious, but that grew as she spoke. She was intelligent, sensitive, funny in the right measure, and with a spontaneity that disarmed any attempt at control. They met at a business event, on a panel about innovation and social impact. Daniel, a partner in a technology company focused on corporate process management, had been invited to present a success story. Isabel worked in the marketing department of a multinational company. They found themselves side by chance, and did not exchange a word until the coffee break. But a casual comment about the bad catering at the event was enough to start a conversation that did not end that night. And perhaps would not have ended until today. They dated for almost 2 years before getting married. It was an apparently solid relationship, based on mutual admiration, respect and many shared projects. Isabel, despite her rising career, did not hesitate to move to another city when Daniel decided to open a new branch of the company. She said that he was her home. And he believed that with her he had finally found the kind of love that did not require armor. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a modern house, full of large windows, where natural light flooded the rooms and the late afternoons brought a peace that seemed rare these days. They did not have children, but they talked about it as a plan, something that would come in due time. She said that she wanted to be a mother after 35, when she was more confident in her choices and in herself. Daniel, Patient as always, agreed. The couple's routine was marked by balance. They shared silent coffees on weekday mornings, exchanged light kisses when leaving for work, laughed together at the absurd news on the evening news, and, on weekends, they invented rituals. Sunday afternoons were reserved for cooking together. She loved testing pasta recipes, he preferred grilling meat. And even when the recipes went wrong, they ended up laughing. They traveled frequently, but preferred simple destinations, away from the spotlight. Countrysides, wineries, cabins high in the mountains. Places where time seemed to pass more slowly and cell phones lost their importance. In their social circles, they were seen as the perfect couple. And there was, in fact, something captivating about the way they treated each other in public. Isabel was charismatic, knew how to charm with words and always knew what to say at dinners and gatherings. Daniel, more discreet, was the silent bass that sustained the meetings with his calm and generous listening. The two formed a pleasant presence at company events, at friends' birthdays and even at family lunches, where the naturalness with which they complimented each other always drew attention. He looked at her tenderly, even in trivial moments. And she reciprocated with small gestures, a touch on the hand, a smile in the middle of the conversation, an inside joke whispered between glasses of wine. Daniel was a partner with two longtime friends, Lucas and Tiago. The three of them had started the company practically from scratch, while they were still in college, developing customized technological solutions for small businesses. Over time, they grew, expanded their scope, and invested in new areas until they became a reference in the market. Lucas was the most outgoing, the one who dealt with clients, participated in events, and networked masterfully. Tiago was more technical and strategic, and preferred to work behind the scenes. Daniel, on the other hand, balanced both sides. He knew how to negotiate, but he also understood coding and management. The three complemented each other and their friendship seemed unshakable. They not only spent time together at work, but also in their personal lives. Trips, barbecues, weekends at the country house, birthdays. In addition to being partners, they were almost like brothers. Tiago, in particular, was the closest to Daniel. They had a connection that went back to their school days. They shared stories, secrets, and even frustrations. It was the kind of friendship that spans decades and seems to be stormproof. Daniel trusted him as someone who trusts themselves. And Isabel had also created bonds with her husband's friends. Especially with Tiago, with whom she shared deeper conversations, since he was the most introspective and curious. They discussed books, TV series, art, human behavior. Sometimes they would get lost in philosophical conversations, while the others talked about football or politics. And that never seemed to be a problem. On the contrary, Daniel always thought it was beautiful to see how the two of them understood each other. In recent months, however, something had subtly changed in the dynamic between Daniel and Isabel. It wasn't an obvious breakup, but a faint, almost imperceptible feeling of distance. Their conversations were less spontaneous, their touches were quicker, their glances less lingering. Isabel, who had always been enthusiastic about the couple's little rituals, seemed increasingly tired and distracted. When questioned, she said she was overwhelmed at work, dealing with a new campaign that required more of her attention. Daniel, always understanding, respected her space, believing that difficult times happen in any relationship. The most obvious change was in her presence at the company's social events. Previously a regular participant, she now frequently found excuses not to go. She said she needed to rest, that she had a migraine, that she wanted some time alone. Daniel began to attend alone on some occasions. And although he missed his wife's company, he tried not to take it personally. He attributed it to her stressful routine, to the natural cycles of life. And whenever Isabel smiled lightly again, he clung to that spark of hope as if it were confirmation that they were still in one piece. On the professional side, everything continued to grow. The company had signed a major contract with a multinational logistics company and was preparing a celebration party. The event would be a landmark one, bringing together partners, employees and important representatives from the sector. It was a night that everyone was looking forward to. Daniel had planned to arrive early, but a last-minute meeting made him late. And it was precisely this change in plans that would begin the silent turnaround in history. He didn't know, at that moment, that night would put him in front of a new version of himself. That the feeling of comfort that he believed he had built with such care would begin to unravel without noise, without fanfare. That the certainties that had sustained him for years would begin to be questioned in silence, like a loose thread in a well-woven plot. And that there, at that exact point in time, reality began to change. But for now, in that nighttime introduction, everything still seemed normal. The sky was clear, the city was pulsating with lights and sounds, and Daniel, at the wheel, drove calmly, imagining just another celebration with colleagues. He had no idea that the next steps would lead him to the beginning of a story that would change not only his marriage, but his entire life. And it would all start there. When he least expected it. That night, Daniel parked his car a few meters from the entrance to the event hall, adjusted his tie with one hand and checked for the third time if he had left anything on the passenger seat. He was late, but nothing that would make him lose his composure. The company event was the biggest they had ever organized and he wanted everything to go perfectly, even if he had not managed to arrive with the other partners. He took a deep breath before entering and, as he walked through the glass doors, he was immediately enveloped by the warm light of the chandeliers, the constant buzz of conversation, the sounds of glasses clinking and the background music that filled every corner of the hall. He walked around greeting employees, shaking hands, exchanging smiles and thanks as he searched for familiar faces. He felt good there, like a discreet host, observing the success of everything he had helped to build with so much effort. Until, as he looked towards the center of the dance floor, his body reacted before his mind understood. A crowd danced lightly, carried along by the classic soundtrack of the hired band. But two bodies stood out from the rest. Not for their exuberance, nor for their movement itself, but for their connection. A man and a woman. Laughing. Looking into each other's eyes intimately. His hands were firm on her waist, pulling her with a confidence that went beyond the music. And she didn't resist, she didn't back away, she didn't hide it. She let herself be carried away. Daniel didn't need more than 3 seconds to recognize the two. The man was Tiago. The woman, Isabel. The image was imprinted with such force that everything around him seemed to lose its sound, light and meaning. Daniel's chest tightened in a silent blow, the muscles in his face stiffened, his eyes burned, but his body remained still. Only his heart seemed to be struggling against his ribs, like a prisoner begging for freedom. And as much as he wanted to, he couldn't move, couldn't react. He stood there, caught up in the scene like someone watching an accident about to happen, with no way of stopping it. The dance ended, the applause covering the internal silence that dominated Daniel. Isabel walked away laughing, touched Tiago's shoulder as if thanking him for something secret, and disappeared among the guests. Tiago headed to the bar with the naturalness of someone who had committed no crime. Daniel then turned around, avoiding the greetings, the smiles and even the light. He left through the side doors, walking aimlessly through the cold corridors of the hotel. He felt as if he had passed through a mirror and woken up in a distorted version of reality. The pain was not like a sharp blade, it was like a silent erosion. He had known something was wrong for weeks, but seeing was different from imagining. There was a different weight in witnessing. Because seeing no longer allows denial. In the following days, Daniel didn't tell anyone anything. He went home, slept next to Isabel, watched her in silence, listened to her words as if they were part of a play. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, her longer showers, her cell phone turned upside down, her smiles that seemed rehearsed. She was still affectionate, but there was a layer of distance in her eyes. And for the first time, he didn't know if he wanted to confront her or just understand. He needed to be sure. So, instead of yelling, he chose to observe. He installed a tracker on Isabel's car. He accessed her cell phone's location system through the iCloud account that had been shared in the past. And what he found, little by little, began to dismantle the rest of what he still had inside. She left work early, but she didn't get home at the same time. She stopped at cafes far away, where they rarely went. She spent the night in hotels with discreet names, whose records matched Tiago's absences from company meetings. Even though there were no photos, videos, or explicit messages, the pattern was clear. And cruel. Daniel began to live in two worlds, the routine disguised as normality and the silent suspicion that corroded his peace. At work, he remained professional, but his smile was shorter, his gaze more vacant. He began to be absent more, to delegate, to leave meetings before the end. At home, he became more and more of a spectator. And Isabel, she seemed lighter. Which, for Daniel, was the most painful thing of all. One Tuesday night, he arrived home early and found Isabel in the kitchen, preparing a risotto. She smiled and said she missed him, that they had been apart and that she wanted to reconnect. Daniel nodded, got the wine from the wine cellar and helped her with the dishes. They had dinner under soft lighting, exchanged memories, talked about the past. For a few moments, he wanted to believe that it was still real. That maybe it was just a phase. But the memory of the touch she exchanged with Tiago at the company party came back clearly every time she smiled. And that killed any attempt at reconstruction. It was the following Saturday that the truth finally dawned on him with the force of a gale. Isabel said she was going out with some colleagues from work for a sort of creative retreat at a country hotel. Daniel already knew where she was going. And this time, he decided not to stay home. He waited 2 hours and drove to the hotel. He arrived before sunset, parked the car on a side street, put on a cap and sunglasses, and watched the entrance. It wasn't long before he saw Tiago arrive. He was alone, with a small backpack and a relaxed expression. He seemed familiar with the place. 15 minutes later, Isabel appeared. Dressed lightly, hair loose, eyes attentively looking around. When she saw him, she hugged him tightly. There was no hesitation. No guilt. Only desire and comfort. They walked in together, smiling, disappearing beyond the reception. Daniel stayed in the car for almost an hour. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't call anyone. He just stayed there, breathing as if the oxygen was being dosed, trying to keep his body together while inside everything was tearing itself apart. He drove home in silence, as if every kilometer he traveled was making what he had just seen even more distant. And when he arrived, he went straight to the office, grabbed a blue folder where he had already organized documents and evidence, and began preparing the divorce papers. In the following days, he began to act calmly. He planned each step with surgical coldness. He let Isabel believe that nothing had changed. He continued to make coffee for both of them in the morning, asked about work, and complimented one or two outfits. But behind the routine, there was a countdown going on. He scheduled meetings with lawyers, set deadlines, adjusted company contracts, and drafted clauses for the separation of assets. He prepared for the end like someone organizing a ceremony, without rushing, but with absolute precision. The day before he was due to submit the documents, he invited Isabel to dinner at an elegant restaurant, one of those they had frequented when they were first dating. She accepted enthusiastically, saying that she missed those moments. She dressed up meticulously, wearing a dress that he had given her as a gift months before. She looked beautiful. They sat at the table, toasted with white wine, and laughed about old stories. Daniel looked at her as if saying goodbye in silence. At the end of dinner, he handed her an envelope with his name written on it. She smiled curiously and asked what it was. But when she opened it, the smile died on her lips. She read each line in silence. Her eyes trembled, her hand froze, and her face lost color. When she finished, she looked up and asked if it was a mistake. Daniel simply said no. And that he had already accepted that the mistake had started long before that night. She didn't cry there. She just asked to talk at home. On the way back, he drove while she kept her eyes fixed on the window. When they arrived, she finally broke down. She said she had gotten lost, that she wasn't what she seemed, that she didn't know how it had started. She tried to justify it with confusing words, but Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened. And in each sentence of hers, he realized that now, finally, she saw what she had done. But only now. Only when the ground moved away. Only when he let her go. She asked for another chance. She begged for time. She said she loved him, that she had gotten confused, that she couldn't bear to lose him. But he was somewhere else. In a new inner dimension where love was no longer enough. Where dignity began to speak louder than desire. And there, that night, when she saw that it might be too late, Daniel realized something he hadn't understood until then. That she only valued him when she understood that he might not be there anymore. When she saw that the loss was real. And that the man she thought would never leave, was already leaving. But there was something else. Something that neither she nor Tiago had any idea about. A detail that Daniel had carried with him since the day he saw them dancing. A fragment of truth that would change everything. And that fragment, was about to come to light. Isabel woke up before sunrise that Monday, her body still aching from insomnia and her head throbbing from the barely contained tears of the night before. The house was silent, but not peaceful. Daniel's absence on her side of the bed made that emptiness even crueler. He had left early, as he always did, but without leaving a message, without touching, without looking. Just an absence that weighed heavily. She walked to the kitchen with dragging steps, grabbed a mug, poured the still hot coffee from the thermos, and stood there, watching the smoke rise. The familiar smell, which had once meant comfort, now made her sick. She was no longer sure of anything. She no longer knew what could still be saved. She wanted to talk, to explain, but she feared that any word could push him further away. She felt that something had changed irreversibly, that his gaze carried a new awareness, like someone who had discovered a hidden territory within themselves and now knew exactly where they would never tread again. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't go to work that day. He had something else to take care of. A cycle needed to come to an end. He spent the morning in silence, inside a small, discreet cafe, waiting for someone he still didn't know if he would have the courage to face. But he needed to. To understand. To conclude. In front of him, a folder. Inside it, the last pieces of the puzzle he had been carefully putting together over the last few weeks. Photographs, screenshots of conversations, location data, receipts. But also a letter. Handwritten. A truth he had discovered by accident, but which changed everything. Something that not even Isabel knew. And that he himself took a while to believe. At noon, a black car pulled up in front of the cafe. The door opened and Tiago got out, his face carrying the same confidence as always, but his eyes betraying a slight fear. Daniel watched him approach, without moving a muscle, just letting him sit in front of him. The two remained silent for several seconds, until Daniel simply said, "Sit down, we need to talk." Tiago tried to keep his tone light, as he always did when things seemed about to get out of hand. He said that they were there as adults, that he wanted to clear up any misunderstandings, that nothing was as it seemed. But Daniel cut him off with a short and direct sentence, "I know everything." Tiago's expression froze. He didn't ask what he knew. He just looked away and let out a sigh as if he finally recognized that there was nothing left to hide. And when the silence fell again, Daniel placed the folder with the documents on the table, without opening it. But that wasn't what he wanted to show. That, he knew, didn't matter so much anymore. What came now was the real weight of the story. Daniel took a smaller, yellowish envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "This changed everything," he said in a firm voice. Tiago looked confused, but didn't touch the envelope. He just waited. Daniel then began to speak, unhurriedly, as if choosing each word with the precision of someone who knows there's no going back. He said that, days after the company party, still trying to find some explanation, he decided to look for images from the hotel's security cameras. Not just out of curiosity, but out of the impulse of someone who needs to understand what he can't accept. He said it wasn't hard to find, since he was a regular customer and had contact with the manager. And that when he reviewed the images, he was just looking to confirm what he already suspected. But instead, he found something different. Something that completely paralyzed him. In the recording, a short clip, lasting just a few minutes, showed something that no one else had seen. Right after the dance ended, Tiago had gone to the bar alone. Isabel, contrary to what he had imagined, had not returned to the guests immediately. She had gone off to one of the ballroom's balconies, where she remained alone for about 4 minutes, visibly nervous. She played with her hair, bit her lips, and walked in circles. And then, in an abrupt gesture, she took her cell phone out of her bag and began recording an audio. Daniel could not hear the content. But, when he cross-referenced the dates and records, he discovered that the audio had been sent to himself. An audio that he had never listened to because it was automatically archived as spam, due to an email synchronization error between his phone and the company's server. He had only found it by chance, when reviewing old folders on his computer. And the content of that audio was what changed everything. In the audio, Isabel spoke in a shaky tone, almost out of breath, saying that she needed to tell him something important. That she had made a mistake, but that mistake was not what she thought. She said that she had felt something strange coming from Tiago for months, but that night, when she danced with him, she had finally understood. That the gestures, the looks, all of that was not innocent. He had approached her in a calculated way, manipulating situations, testing limits, putting emotional pressure on her with ambiguous conversations and caresses disguised as friendship. And that night, when they danced, he kissed her on the cheek and whispered things that made her tremble. She said that it was not right, that she needed time to understand what was happening, but that, above all, she needed to tell Daniel, because she did not want to hide anything. She ended the audio by saying that she did not know what she would do yet, but that the only thing she knew was that she did not want to lose the man she had always loved. When he finished telling the story, Daniel pushed the envelope toward Tiago. Inside was a complete transcript of the audio. Tiago read each line, and as he read, the color in his face changed. He began to mumble explanations, saying that Isabel was confused, that she was giving mixed signals, that it was a complex relationship between friends. But Daniel interrupted. He said he didn't want to know what he thought. He said he now understood that he had been betrayed in ways that went much deeper than just his body. Betrayed by trust, by friendship, by the absence of ethical boundaries. Because even if Isabel had lost her way at some point, he, Tiago, could never have crossed that line. Because he knew Daniel better than anyone. He knew every pain, every trauma, every fear. And yet, he chose to enter. Tiago finally lowered his eyes and confessed. He said he had always admired Isabel. At first it was just admiration, but over time, it turned into fascination. That during nights of conversation, she made him feel something he hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. That he didn't know how to deal with it. That he tried to resist, but when he realized it, he was already too involved. He said he believed she felt something too, but that deep down, he knew he was the one forcing the moments. That he manipulated with words, gestures, timing. Daniel listened to everything in silence, but each word was a knife being slowly thrust in. Not only because of the pain of what had been done, but because of the full awareness that, on some level, he had already lost them both a long time ago. And now there was nothing left to rescue. When he left the cafe, Daniel didn't look back. He knew that this was the last chapter between him and Tiago. There would be no public confrontations, fights, or scandals. Just a clean, definitive break. When he got home, he found Isabel sitting on the couch, with red eyes and a pale face. She asked him if he hated her. He said no. That what he felt was worse than that. He felt sorry. Not for her. But for what they had stopped being. He told her about the audio, about the recording, about everything she had learned. And she, through tears, confirmed it. She said she had tried to resist. That she felt guilty. That she felt weak. But that at no point did she want to lose Daniel. He simply replied that she had already lost him. And not because of the dance. But because she had stopped looking for him when there was still time. That night, he packed his bags. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He just packed up what was left of himself and left. Isabel stayed there, sitting on the floor, with her eyes fixed on the closed door. For the first time, she understood that regret is not enough when the other person has already learned to get up. But Daniel didn't leave with just his bags. He left with the clarity that the love he sought was no longer possible there. Because where there is betrayal, forgiveness can even arise. But respect, once lost, never returns with the same strength. And then, weeks later, something unexpected began to blossom. Something new. Someone new. An old reunion, a forgotten connection, a look that brought back to her face the light that pain had extinguished. Because sometimes, you have to lose everything to find out what you truly deserve. But this was still just the beginning. Daniel changed his home address for a smaller, more functional apartment in a remote neighborhood, where no one knew him and where every corner was free of memories. He took no furniture, no paintings, no objects that could carry memories. Only clothes, books, and the old Italian coffee maker he had used since his youth. He began working remotely for a while, reducing his contact with the environments that suffocated him to a minimum. He requested a partial leave from the company, claiming mental exhaustion, and for the first time in years, he stopped being the pillar of everything. It was not an escape, but a silent realignment, an internal reconfiguration that can only be done when there is nothing left to lose. The nights were long, not because of insomnia, but because the silence was now complete. There was no one to fill the house with footsteps, nor other people's voices saying mechanical phrases. For the first time, the emptiness tasted like peace. Isabel tried to get in touch a few times in the first few weeks. She called, sent short messages, sometimes just a "hi. How are you?" with no response. Then, a few more audio messages that Daniel didn't listen to. He deleted them without opening them. He knew that any fragment of her voice could reopen holes that were already starting to heal. She insisted less over time, but the shadow of what they had been still haunted his thoughts in moments of fragility. It was inevitable to remember the trips, the dinners, the silences shared naturally, but now, everything was just proof that love is not immune to the lack of care. And this awareness, although painful, strengthened him. The company continued to operate. Lucas took on a more prominent role and did not comment on Tiago, who had asked to leave under the pretext of personal matters. Daniel avoided any mention, but there was a silent agreement between the partners that if the other returned, there would be no more room for coexistence. This was not just a personal issue, but also a matter of trust, something that, once broken between leaders, contaminates the entire structure. The decision was made without needing to be said. It was on a cloudy afternoon, in a regular supermarket, that Daniel met Helena again. She was in the checkout line, with a packet of pasta in her hand and a cookbook under her arm. She smiled when she saw him and said his name with a naturalness that awakened something dormant. They had studied together at college for a few years, but had never really gotten close. He remembered her as someone discreet, observant, with a dry sense of humor and an almost disconcerting calm. They talked right there, laughing about old memories, and before saying goodbye, she invited him for coffee the next day, saying she lived nearby. Daniel hesitated for a second, but accepted. Not out of need, but because he felt curious. And at that time, curiosity was lighter than the weight of loneliness. The next day, they sat in a small cafe, with walls lined with books and soft music playing from hidden boxes. The conversation flowed as if the years between them had merely fallen asleep, not passed. Helena owned an independent bookstore, wrote columns for a local newspaper, and cared for her elderly mother. She spoke passionately about the little things, the smell of old books, the joy of seeing someone discover a new author, the pleasure of cooking slowly. Daniel found himself listening attentively, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. She didn't ask intrusive questions or broach subjects that weren't hers. She was a presence. And that, for him, was already rare. Over time, the meetings became more frequent. There were walks around the organic market, late afternoon walks, impromptu coffees in bookstores. There were no demands, no promises, no urgency. And precisely for that reason, there was truth. On one of those afternoons, Daniel told part of his story, without going into details. He just said that he had gotten out of a long, difficult relationship and that he was still reorganizing himself inside. Helena just nodded. She didn't offer advice or judgment. She just remained silent, holding his hand under the table. And that was when he understood, sometimes, all we need is someone who won't try to fix us. Meanwhile, Isabel sank into a silence of a different nature. The house that had once vibrated with their presence was now cold, noisy with echoes. She slept badly, ate less, and worked automatically. Her friends gradually distanced themselves, not out of judgment, but out of discomfort. She had become a tense presence, difficult to decipher. Tiago tried to look for her in the first few days after her conversation with Daniel, but she avoided him. She said she needed to be alone, that she didn't know what she felt, that everything had lost its meaning. And indeed, it had. What had been fascination had become a burden. What had been desire had become guilt. And what had been illusion had become consequences. One night, alone on the porch, she opened the photo album on her cell phone and saw a picture he had taken of her smiling, with her hair tied up awkwardly, holding a glass of wine. The caption was simply, "You, like this." She cried for hours. But the tears would not come back. They asked themselves for forgiveness for not knowing how to recognize the value of those who loved them. Helena and Daniel grew closer with the kind of tenderness that doesn't require a show. At an informal dinner, he prepared a simple dish, put on some background music, and the two sat on the living room floor with glasses of wine and loose stories. They laughed about their culinary failures, exchanged ideas about movies, and at the end of the night, when she rested her head on his shoulder, there was a silence that didn't ask for translation. It was the silence of someone who no longer needed to explain what they felt. The days passed and the connection grew stronger. Daniel felt that, with Helena, there was space. Space to exist without fear. To be vulnerable without running the risk of being used against him. And that was exactly what made him truly free. When Isabel found out he was with someone else, it was by chance. She saw a photo on a mutual friend's stories. Daniel was next to a woman, smiling, with a serene look. They weren't hugging, there were no kisses, no poses. But the intimacy between them was evident. And it hurt. Not because of jealousy. But because she understood that he had managed to move on. That he had been able to rebuild. That she, despite all her attempts to get closer, had never even come close to that. She tried to write something, a short message, maybe a goodbye. But there weren't enough words to rebuild the bridge that she herself had burned. One cloudy afternoon, months later, the two met by chance at the door of a bank. They exchanged tense glances, a restrained greeting. Isabel commented something trivial, and he responded politely. And the moment she touched his arm and said, "Are you okay?" he responded with a slight smile and a simple, "I'm at peace." He said nothing more. And that was like a full stop. There was no anger, no hurt, no irony. Just peace. A peace that is born when pain becomes memory, and memory no longer hurts. That night, when she got home, Isabel sat on the couch and stayed there for hours. No TV, no music, no cell phone. She just breathed in her own silence. For the first time, she didn't think about going back in time. She only thought about how to build a future that didn't depend on anyone to be complete. And there, in that emptiness, she began her own reconstruction. That same night, Daniel was preparing dinner with Helena, now in his new house, with large windows and few pieces of furniture, but full of calm. While she cut tomatoes and he stirred the pan, they both laughed about something silly. He looked at her for a moment longer, and said that, of all the things he had lost in life, the one that surprised him the most was finding himself again on the way back. Helena didn't respond with words. She just touched his hand, and in that touch there was everything he needed to know. Because sometimes, the true happy ending isn't about winning back what was lost, but discovering that, even when broken, it's still possible to love again, and, more than that, to be loved completely. Helena had been closing the bookstore later in the last few weeks. Spring had made the afternoons milder, and many customers liked to come in, have a coffee, and talk about books as if they were visiting an old friend. Daniel, whenever he could, would show up at the end of the day. There were no big plans between them, nor any urgency. They were content with that discreet routine, in the shared silence while they organized the shelves or swept dry leaves from the sidewalk. She understood his silences, and he felt no need to hide his wounds. But despite the present calm, there was still an echo that reverberated inside, not of pain, but of reflection. Daniel did not ignore what he had experienced, nor did he erase the past. It was there, imprinted in the most banal gestures, like a trauma that no longer hurts, but that shapes the way one walks. It was in this delicate crossing between past and present that he moved now, trying to understand, not only what had happened, but what it said about who he was, and about who he could still become. Isabel had moved to a new apartment. She left the house she shared with Daniel, even though she was taking her time, like someone who was slowly dismantling the scenery of a lifetime. She sold some furniture, donated clothes, and put some photos and letters that had once meant everything in boxes. The new home was smaller and more practical. It had fewer spaces, fewer decorations, and less noise. She worked hard in the first few months to distract herself from herself. But when night fell and work no longer filled the void, her thoughts came back like waves. She tried to reconnect with people from the past, but almost all of her friendships seemed fragile now. Some had evaporated with the end of her marriage. Others had drifted away with the silent scandal of betrayal. And there were those who remained, but with a different outlook, like someone looking at a cracked vase that could break at any moment. It was in this solitude that she began to write. Daily. A blue notebook she kept on the living room table became her safe space. It wasn't a traditional diary, but a collection of letters that would never be sent. Some were addressed to Daniel. Others, to herself. Some began with anger, others with regret. But they all ended with the same feeling, a genuine desire to rebuild herself, even though no one was expecting it. One of those nights, she wrote, "I can't go back, but maybe I can go on. Maybe the guilt won't go away, but I'll learn to walk with it without stumbling all the time." There was an awareness in those words that hadn't been there before, a maturity that didn't come with age, but with loss. She started attending a support group, not out of obligation, but because she realized she needed to hear other stories. And there, among strangers who had also lost important things, she felt seen for the first time in a long time without judgment. They were emotionally broken people trying to find new ground. And in that collective weakness, she found strength. On the other side of the city, Daniel was facing a dilemma he hadn't expected. Lucas, the partner who had stood by him throughout the process, proposed an aggressive expansion of the company, including opening a branch in another country. It was a chance to start over, to grow in an unprecedented way, but this would mean two things: leaving the foundation of everything they had built over so many years and, more than that, physically distancing themselves from Helena, who couldn't move. The bookstore was his universe, his essence, his home. The conversation between them was long and painful. Helena, despite being sad, said she wouldn't stop him. That she understood his ambition, his need to prove to himself that he was capable of rebuilding not only his personal life, but also his professional life. Daniel, on the other hand, found himself torn between the security of a serene love and the restlessness of a project that could mean the pinnacle of his career. For the first time, the two faced each other not as a couple in love, but as adults aware that love is not always enough to solve everything. This choice affected Daniel more than he expected. He didn't sleep well and avoided the subject until he decided to leave the company indefinitely. It wasn't cowardice, it was a pause. He wanted to understand if what was driving him now was a thirst for revenge disguised as overcoming or if it was actually a genuine desire for growth. He talked to Lucas, expressed his doubts honestly and, to his surprise, he was respected. Lucas, pragmatic, said he would hold on and that when he knew what he really wanted, the doors would be open. It was the first time in years that Daniel chose not to prove himself. And this decision brought unexpected relief. Meanwhile, Tiago reappeared. He sent a short message, without apologies or pretexts. He just wanted to say that he had left the company for good. He was going to another state, to start over in another area. He said that he didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. He just needed him to know that he had understood the impact of his choices. Daniel read the message calmly. He didn't respond. But something inside him softened. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first step towards indifference, and indifference was all he wanted to feel for someone who had once been his brother. Helena, in turn, noticed that Daniel was starting to come back to himself. He no longer had the heavy look of someone waiting for the next blow. He was already smiling more with his eyes than with his lips. And it was then that she told him that she needed to travel to take care of her mother, who was undergoing delicate treatment. I would be away for a few weeks, maybe months. Daniel hugged her tightly and said he would be waiting. But neither she nor he knew if there would be a later. Because life, as they had learned, does not work with guarantees. On their last date before the trip, she took him to the park where they used to walk when they first started their relationship. They sat on a wooden bench under a huge tree, its branches swaying lazily in the warm afternoon wind. Helena took a white envelope out of her bag. Inside was a letter. Don't read it now. Only when you feel the need to understand what's left. He promised he would keep it. And so, between silences full of meaning, she left. In the following days, Daniel returned to his solitary routine with a new lightness. He rediscovered the pleasure of walking alone, of observing people without judging, of cooking without rushing. He visited bookstores, attended exhibitions, and watched old movies. He finally felt whole. One night, when he opened the drawer where he kept his documents, he saw Helena's envelope. He sat down, opened it carefully, and read it. It was a simple but profound letter. It said that she loved him, but that love, sometimes, also means knowing how to give him space. It said that she didn't know if she would come back the same, or if he would still be there. But if they were, he hoped it would be because they both chose to be there. Not out of fear, not out of attachment. But out of free, mature, and conscious love. On the last page, an underlined sentence: you don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be true. Daniel closed his eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt that everything had made sense. Not because it ended well, but because the process had transformed him. And maybe, in the end, that's what matters. That, regardless of what you lose, you learn to find yourself again. Even if it takes time. Even if it hurts. Even if you don't know exactly how to move on. Because he had already conquered the most important thing, himself. And no one else could take that away. In the third week after Helena's departure, Daniel returned to the old park where they used to walk. Not because he expected to find her there, but because that place had become a point of balance between memory and the present. The trees still swayed with the same gentleness, the birds followed the same paths through the sky, and the couples who walked hand in hand seemed unaware of the weight that can exist between two people who once loved each other deeply. He observed everything with a mature stillness, as if his heart had finally understood that life does not give back what is lost, but sometimes offers something different, and that the new does not always need to be compared to the old to have value. I walked along the trails with my headphones turned off, without music, without distractions. I wanted to hear the world. I wanted to understand how it sounded now that the storm had passed. One morning, while drinking coffee in a new bookstore that had just opened nearby, he came across a woman reading a book that Helena had recommended some time ago. The cover was worn, her fingers caressed the edges of the pages with silent delicacy. He approached her, started a conversation with a simple comment about the story, and within minutes they were both laughing. There was no tension, no expectation, just two people sharing a light moment. Her name was Laura, she was an illustrator and had recently moved. They talked for over an hour and, at the end, exchanged contact details without any urgency to repeat the same thing. Daniel left feeling lighter, not because he had met someone, but because he realized that it was possible to connect again, without carrying the weight of comparison on his shoulders, without fear of betraying a memory. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Isabel was having her last session with the support group. She felt she had reached a turning point. It wasn't about overcoming, nor about absolute self-forgiveness, but about understanding. For the first time, she could look back without destroying herself. She knew she would never be the same woman. And, in a way, that was good. She had understood that loving was not enough if there was no care, that it was not enough to wish well if her actions caused hurt. She decided that she would no longer explain herself to the people who had distanced herself. She did not expect everyone to understand her, nor to accept her choices. Her reconstruction no longer depended on the acceptance of others. Now she just wanted to move on. She enrolled in a creative writing course and began contributing to a blog about relationships, not to give advice, but to report what she had learned in the process. A column a week, published anonymously, was her way of giving back to the world a little of what she had learned about regret, about loss, about rebuilding. It was in one of these chronicles that Daniel recognized her. The text was about someone who watched love slip through their fingers and only understood its gravity when it was too late. There were passages that sounded like a mirror of what they had experienced. He read it to the end without stopping, with his heart oscillating between discomfort and empathy. He didn't feel anger. He felt respect. Because, despite everything, she had found a path. And he knew how difficult it was to walk it alone. He didn't tell anyone. He just saved the link, closed the browser and went back to writing in his own notebook, something he had stopped doing. He wrote about missing someone. But not the person. The version of himself that existed before the disappointment. And he ended the text with a sentence that sounded like an intimate promise: the part that was me and was lost will not come back, but the part that is born now will be whole. The following week, Daniel received a message from Helena. Short and to the point, "I'm back." He paused for a moment, looked at his cell phone screen, and reread it once more. There was no invitation, no pressure, just a statement. He replied with, "Whenever you want, stop by." Minutes later, she replied with an address and a time. It wasn't at her house. It was at the old bookstore, which was reopening that day after being closed for weeks. He arrived before the agreed time and stood outside looking at the illuminated sign. His heart felt calm but alert. When she appeared at the door, wearing a light blouse and her hair tied up simply, something reorganized inside him. She smiled with the same serenity as before, but there was a new depth in her eyes. They went in without saying anything. She put water to boil, grabbed 2 cups, and placed them on the counter. And then she said, in a firm voice, "I don't know how you are. But I had to go. And now, I just want to know if there's still room for us to walk together, even if slowly." Daniel watched her for a few seconds, crossed his arms and answered unhurriedly. "I didn't wait. But I didn't leave either. I just lived. And today, I'm whole. If I'm going to be light, with truth, without fear, yes. There's still room." She smiled, and that smile was enough. They didn't hug, they didn't kiss. They sat on the floor, leaning against the shelves, as they had done so many times before. They began to organize the books, one by one. Time passed slowly, and that was all they needed. That same night, Isabel finished writing a new column. She talked about encounters that never come back, about loves that never last, but are still important. She said that sometimes, losing is what teaches us to care. And that the greatest form of love, sometimes, is accepting that the other person is happy away from us. She signed the column with her name for the first time. And when she published it, she felt something different. As if, finally, she no longer needed to hide. The next day, Daniel received the link to the article from a friend who had not heard of the story. He read it in silence. At the end, he simply sent a "thank you" to the anonymous email address associated with the publications. Isabel received it, read it, and smiled. She did not respond. She knew that this thank you was the most beautiful ending they could have. Not as a new beginning, but as a dignified end. And that, sometimes, is all one needs to move on. Laura, the illustrator, still exchanged messages with Daniel from time to time. Light conversations, about art, about new cafes in the city. But they both knew that this was just a brief crossing of paths. And that's okay. Not every encounter has to turn into a story. Sometimes, it just needs to be a beautiful break in the routine. Helena and Daniel, now closer, decided to keep things simple. No exaggerated promises, no long-term plans. Just presence. He gradually returned to work at the company, taking on new projects with more autonomy. He created an internal program to provide psychological support to employees, something he had always wanted to implement but never had the courage to do. Now it made sense. The pain transformed into action. And that motivated him. Isabel, in turn, was invited by a publisher to turn her chronicles into a book. She hesitated, but accepted. She knew that writing about pain was not an act of exposure, but of healing. The book, still untitled, began to take shape in notebooks, digital files, and during nights of intense writing. Life did not give her back what she had lost, but it offered her the chance to make sense of what was left. And she embraced it with courage. And so, on parallel paths, those who once loved each other, were hurt, and lost each other, have now learned to exist outside the cycle of pain. Not as if nothing had happened. But as if everything had taught them. Because love, even when it fails, teaches. Because pain, when embraced, transforms. And because, in the end, it is not happy endings that make us whole. But rather, what we do with the endings we receive. On that morning of clear skies and warm air, Daniel woke up before the alarm clock rang, as if his body already knew that the day would bring a new cycle. Beside him, Helena's pillow still held the warmth of the night before. She was in the kitchen making coffee, putting on his shirt, humming a soft melody that he didn't recognize. That scene, so simple, brought to his mind the exact opposite of what he had once experienced. Now there was serenity, lightness, respect. No more footsteps in the sand sinking with each movement, but solid ground, where it was finally possible to plant and harvest. He approached her slowly, hugged her from behind and whispered that he had made a decision. He was going to sell his share in the company. He wanted to start something new, more human, closer to people. He no longer wanted to build empires while his soul dried up inside. He wanted meaning. And he had found it in her, in that house, in the calm of the days, in the love that required no effort to exist. Helena smiled, without surprise, just with that look that understood before even hearing. She said that wherever he decided to go, she would walk alongside him. But this time, he needed to be sure that this choice was for him, not out of fear of losing someone again. And he assured her, it was not an escape, it was a reunion. From then on, they began working together on a project that combined literature, listening and welcoming. An open house for people who wanted to write about their pain, share their stories, heal wounds through words. They didn't call it a clinic or a workshop. They called it a shelter. And that's what they created. A shelter of stories. On the other hand, Isabel launched her book under a title that drew silence, Things I Learned After Destroying Myself. The work gained attention, not because of its glamour or confession, but because of the brutal honesty with which it addressed mistakes, omissions, shortcomings disguised as desire and, above all, how much can be lost when one does not listen to love while it still exists. In interviews, she spoke with composure, without dramatization, always reinforcing that the greatest pain of betrayal was not being discovered, but looking into the eyes of someone who once trusted you and knowing that nothing you say will be able to restore that trust. The book became required reading in many emotional support groups. Some attacked her, calling her an opportunist, others praised her for her courage. But Isabel did not write to please. She wrote to restore meaning to what she had experienced. And it was in this process that she finally forgave herself. Not to forget what she had done, but to not destroy herself daily for something that had already been destroyed enough. One night, at the end of a lecture, a woman approached with tears in her eyes and said that she had left her husband for a 3-month affair and that she only realized what she had lost when she saw her daughter cry as she said goodbye to her father. Isabel said nothing. She simply hugged the woman. And in that hug, a part of her was redeemed. She understood that, although she could not erase the past, she could help others not to repeat it. Tiago, in turn, reappeared years later in a discreet article about a social project aimed at at-risk youth. He was living in the countryside, living modestly, and had founded an NGO that used theater as an instrument of transformation. His eyes seemed older, but there was a peace in his expression that had not existed before. He did not give interviews, did not use social media, and did not talk about the past. Some said he had become a monk, others that he lived in isolation out of shame. But the truth was simpler. He had understood that what he had built with lies did not deserve to be rebuilt with apologies. And he chose to simply start over where no one expected anything from him other than his presence. Years later, he wrote a letter to Daniel, sent on paper, with no return address, with only the following content: I learned, the hard way, that there are mistakes that cannot be corrected. But there are silences that heal more than 1,000 requests for forgiveness. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have. That taught me more than any punishment. Daniel received the letter on a rainy morning, read it calmly and kept it in a wooden box where there were also old photographs, letters from his mother, notes from college. Things that were no longer visited, but could not be discarded either. Months later, the storytelling shelter created by Daniel and Helena organized its first open event. A meeting of writers and readers in an old mansion, where each room was home to voices, memories, and narratives of transformation. Among the guests, a tall woman with short brown hair caught everyone's attention when she read a text that began like this: I betrayed the love that saved me because I mistook emotion for desire. And today, I write not to be understood, but to not repeat myself. It was Isabel. Invited not by Daniel, but by Helena, who had read the book and believed that healing also meant listening to those who caused pain. Daniel watched the reading in silence. When she finished, the audience applauded respectfully. He approached her at the end, held out his hand, and simply said, You have found your place. She replied, You too. And there were no more words. Just a mutual recognition of how far they had come from that abyss. And so, what began as an open wound turned into multiple journeys of reconstruction. Because, in the end, no one came out unscathed. But everyone came out different. Daniel was now a man who knew how to recognize limits, value presences, and not lose himself trying to keep what he no longer wanted to be saved. Isabel was a woman who now taught others not to sabotage themselves due to lack and who had transformed her guilt into a mission. Tiago chose anonymity as a form of redemption, away from the spotlight, where he finally learned to serve without expecting applause. And Helena, firm and sweet, became a bridge between pain and words, sustaining the shelter of stories like someone who knows that, sometimes, the greatest form of love is to be a foundation without ever trying to be the roof. With that, we finish another story. And now we want to know, what did you think? Comment here with your opinion. Do you agree with the outcome of each character? What would you have done differently? We really want to hear your perspective on everything that each one experienced. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue to bring you intense stories, with exciting plots and endings that leave a mark. And remember, none of the stories here are an incentive to cheat. On the contrary, they are all designed to show, in depth, how cheating not only hurts, but destroys homes, dreams, families, and love itself. May this story serve as a reflection. Sometimes, a choice that seems small can cost everything that mattered most. Fidelity is not a prison, it is a commitment to what you chose to build together. Cheating is not entertainment. It is a real wound. And here, on this channel, we make it clear, we will never support any form of betrayal, until the next story.